toddler's brain and a Supreme Court justice's brain. What's different? Well, a lot. But for our children's early years, we're going to focus on what's most important to us. At this age, that's emotions and behavior. As a parent or caregiver of young children, conceptually knowing how these regions of the brain work together, or in some cases don't, is critical to everything we want for our children. So we're going to take a brief dive into some brain science, and hopefully you find this journey as fascinating as I have. There's been an explosion in brain science, much of it the result of the development of technologies like functional magnetic resonance imaging, or functional MRI, magnetoencephalography, or MEG technology, and functional near-infrared spectroscopy, all of which measure activity by detecting changes associated with blood flow. These were super exciting discoveries, because they allowed brain scientists to watch which regions of the brain worked or didn't as children were thinking or experiencing emotional responses. And the two regions of the brain that are of most interest to us are the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. That's next. Let's talk about our amygdala, and we'll start in the shade of a nut tree next to a babbling brook, let's say 200,000 years ago. There's our ancestor, with her tribe calmly cracking open nuts in a mental state we'll describe as peaceful rest and digest. We're so relaxed that even a chatty squirrel's ancestor is enjoying the bounty. Suddenly, the snap of a twig, the unmistakable eyes of a saber-toothed tiger. Our reaction, and the squirrel's reaction, was so quick, at least for the ones whose genes were passed on to us, that when it's triggered for us today, we aren't even aware of the trigger being pulled. The feeling of fight or flight is on, aka we're stressed. It's extraordinary how lightning fast this cascade happens. It had to be for us to survive. It's so efficient that it happens even before the brain's visual processing has had a chance to evaluate what's occurring. It's why people are able to jump out of the way of an oncoming car before they've had a moment to think, or how seemingly fast you see the squirrel's response in their day-to-day activity. The place in your brain and the squirrel's that recognizes the threat and responds is the amygdala. You're stressed and suddenly adrenaline is pumping into the bloodstream. This ancient part of the brain evolved about 200 million years ago. It's common to all mammals. It's involved in processing fear memories, decision-making, and emotional responses. Even mild stress still activates this system. In 200,000 BC, it might have been days, weeks, even months between threats. But modern humans, well, we've been given a gift. And given the option, this is one we'd happily rewrap and regift. But alas, that option is not available. We've been given the ability to think stressful thoughts, which elicits the same psychological response as if we're in physical danger. So this is our brain in 2020. You're short on sleep because your toddler woke you up several times last night. As a result, lately you've been worried about your job performance. You're getting ready to leave the house and your smartphone is pinging you at such an inopportune moment. Then it rings as you suddenly realize you're late for work. And as you start to answer the phone, a temper tantrum bursts into flames from a very dirty diaper. Is our life actually in danger? Though in the moment, it might almost feel like it, it's not. But we perceive a threat and you're stressed. Clearly, neither the fight or flight response is appropriate in this situation, though you might feel like flight. Yet that's the part of the brain that's in control. The likelihood that you would even have a mate to have children would be probably pretty slim as a modern-day human if your only behavior options were limited to the same behavior of the squirrel, the fight or flight. So how do we wrest control of this fight or flight response? In comes our hero, literally, because it's where in the brain the behavior of heroism exists and every other behavior that makes us human, the prefrontal cortex. So what is this prefrontal cortex? It's the part of the brain that evolved last and where all the behaviors that make us human happen. The Harvard Center on the Developing Child describes the prefrontal cortex as the brain's air traffic control system. And one of its most important jobs is controlling our emotional responses and managing behavior through sets of skills called social-emotional skills and executive functions. Both of these sets of skills are so fundamentally life-changing for children to master that we have video domains and courses dedicated separately to both. Ever wonder why parenting appears to be a full-time job? up to and through the college years? Here's why. The prefrontal cortex is the last part of the brain to develop as we go through childhood and into adulthood. The process is not fully complete until we're into our mid-20s. As you can appreciate for some of us, even then it still needs a little work. So how important are these prefrontal cortex skills? Let's look at executive function skills first. For nearly 30 years, Drs. Avshram Caspi and Terry Moffat have been collaborating on one of the more comprehensive and probing investigations of human development ever conducted. Launched in 1972, the Dunedin Multidisciplinary Health and Development Study has made detailed observations on the lives of about 1,000 New Zealanders and has spun out more than 1,200 papers on questions from risk factors for antisocial behavior and the biological outcomes of stress. So what did they find most relevant to the importance of children's executive function skills? Children with better inhibitory control, who were less impulsive and had better attention regulation 30 years later as adults, had better health, higher incomes, fewer interactions with law enforcement, and a better quality of life than those children who had worse inhibitory control. And a component of inhibitory control is attentional control. If this sounds like it could be related to ADHD, you're onto something. Probably the most recognized researcher in ADHD is Dr. Russell Barkley. He's written dozens of books and hundreds of articles on ADHD. He specifically writes, ADHD is a disorder of self-regulation. Self-regulation requires that a person have intact executive functions. Dr. Del Diamond adds, evidence shows that discipline and executive function accounts for over twice as much variation in grades as his IQ, all the way through college, which leads her to state, small differences in executive function at school entry can translate into large differences in school outcomes and job prospects later on, and executive function skills can be developed. So what about social-emotional learning, or what we refer to as SEL skills? In 2011, a meta-analysis of 213 school-based social-emotional learning programs involving almost 300,000 kindergarten through high school students was published. The students in the SEL program had significantly improved social-emotional skills, attitudes, behavior, and an academic performance that reflected an 11-point gain in achievement. In 2017, the same authors did a follow-up study 3.5 years after the last SEL class, and they showed an academic performance that was 13 points higher. That's from a C+ to an A. They also found that conduct problems, emotional distress, and drug use were all significantly lower, and positive attitudes towards self and others was higher. And social-emotional skills can be taught. So, who would you want dating your daughter? The amygdala-controlled brain, or the one with the prefrontal cortex in charge? So how do we get there? With some architecture. In this case, brain architecture, or neural networks, and how they're built. Dr. Donald Hebb received his PhD at Harvard in 1936 and went on to become the 19th most cited psychologist of the 20th century. Described as the father of neural networks, his famous phrase, "Neurons that fire together wire together," was framed in his 1949 now classic book, The Organization of Behavior. It describes the brain's behavior of creating neural networks from repeated firing of the same neurons. It's essentially this. Every experience, thought, feeling, and physical sensation triggers neurons, which form a neural network. And the key point to understand is that when you repeat an experience over and over, the brain reinforces that pathway or network. So consider how it works. As a not yet toddler learning to walk, it quickly becomes evident that if you don't take a step as you're leaning forward, you're going to fall down. Having that neural network robustly strengthened allows for faster and faster connections that lead to the ability for them to eventually sprint. This process extends to any repeated mental process, from avoiding hot objects to learning to recall words when you're speaking. Then there's this. It's an enemy lurking, common in almost every household. That's the greatest threat to developing those neural networks in young children, which is a critical period in brain development, when neurons that should be firing together and wiring together to create foundational brain architecture upon which later learning can be built could be weak or absent, leading to difficulties in learning and behavior later in life. And it can be severe. According to the American Psychological Association's 2010 Stress in America survey, 69% of respondents recognized that their personal stress affected their children, and only 14% of children said their parents' stress didn't bother them. So here's why understanding the brain science is so important. Let's look at what's going on in the prefrontal cortex when you're stressed. Unlike anywhere else in the brain, even mild stress significantly increases dopamine in the prefrontal cortex. And here's what happens in the prefrontal cortex that happens nowhere else in the brain. It takes it offline, strengthening the emotional responses of the amygdala. Dr. Dan Siegel has a great way of explaining this with his, he calls it his handy hand model of the brain. So if I hold my hand like this, imagine my arm through my wrist is the spinal cord connecting to the brainstem. This is the oldest part of the brain that controls your heart, breathing, digestion. Then that connects to my thumb, which is the limbic area. This is that 200 million year old part of the brain. This is where the amygdalas are. Then over that, the newest part of the brain called the cortex. And the center front connected to my thumb and the amygdalas is the prefrontal cortex. Now notice what happens when we're in our fight or flight response, aka flipping our lid. The PFC, the prefrontal cortex, is disconnected. In an extraordinary response to a life-threatening situation, this is exactly what we would want. Dopamine response, and boom, that baby's offline, and the amygdala is controlling our behavior. Instantaneous instinctive responses. Our ancestors, who were the ones that didn't get a Darwin Award because they instantly focused on self and saved themselves, any sort of prefrontal cortex intervening in the amygdala's instinctive fight or flight response would have been a split-second delay, with the lion most certainly appreciative of the PFC's empathetic response to his hunger pangs, being rewarded with an easy lunch. We evolved such that an empathetic response and stress cannot mutually coexist. So remember that gift of being human we've been given to imagine and perceive a threat? Think back to our brain in 2020. When you're short on sleep, worried about your job performance, getting ready to leave the house, and your smartphone is pinging you? Simply stated, stress takes that part of the brain that makes us human and disconnects it, leaving us subject to our emotional governed ancient brain. Imagine that, parenting your child. Here's what happens. In 1989, a group of researchers at the University of Wisconsin-Madison began the Wisconsin study of families and work, looking at early life stress and its impact on health and functioning across the lifespan. The study recruited more than 500 expectant and new parents who were primarily white, middle-class families, and then followed those children through early adulthood. The following video is a segment from The Raising of America, Early Childhood, and the Future of Our Nation.
Okay, we're going to run a short localizer scan now.
Recently, new neuroimaging technology enabled the Wisconsin team to see whether or not parental stress might impact the very architecture of their adolescent children's brains. The team especially wanted to look at one critical brain circuit, the connection between the amygdala and prefrontal cortex. The amygdala recognizes threat and sounds the alarm. In turn, the prefrontal cortex signals the amygdala whether the alarm is justified.
We want to see a good flow of traffic on that highway because that's a highway that's helping that child regulate their emotion on a moment-to-moment basis. How to deal with emotions, when is it appropriate to express emotions.
So we can get right in the middle of the amygdala there. That looks fantastic.
Great.
So, was there a difference in these two parts of the brain in those adolescents who'd experienced early life parental stress?
When we look at it now that they're 18 years old, we see lower connectivity between the amygdala and prefrontal cortex.
For the kids with early stress exposure, it was just way out of whack. What we found was a pattern that absolutely fits with the rest of our data.
It was an amazing thing to see, and to see such strong associations throughout. And this whole pattern then predicted anxiety in these adolescent girls.
It really is setting up a system that responds differently to stress in the future.
When we're stressed out, we're not taking in as much information. We're not functioning as well in our daily lives. We might be getting everything done, but maybe we're not learning as well.
And so it does have an effect on later achievement and academic outcomes in terms of health and functioning. we know that they do worse than kids who are less stressed.
Our brain's ability to recognize the threat of the saber-toothed tiger is because we evolved to pay attention to the negative. It's called the brain's negativity bias. It's why today we have a much greater tendency to pay attention to the negative than the positive. Recall the processes of the amygdala: fear memories, decision-making, and emotional responses. In the days of the saber-toothed tiger, you see the tiger, you recognize the threat it represents, fear memory, fear for your life, emotion, and run, decision-making. These fundamental functions are why Dr. John Medina states in his book, Brain Rules for Baby, paraphrasing, many parents think their child's brain is interested in learning. It's not. It's interested in surviving. And to do that, it has a negativity bias. Understanding now how the amygdala works, we can apply it to our world as parents and caregivers. Think of the situation we sometimes find ourselves in with young children, where they've not yet learned to control their emotional response. And let's say they hit another child. Our amygdala fires at the moment we hear the other child's cries. We've flipped our lid, prefrontal cortex offline. We rush in, our temper, and depending on the environment, our embarrassment having been kicked up a few notches. And before you can stop yourself, justifying what's next is the method by which you're going to change your child's behavior, you yell, "We don't hit!" And maybe, in the heat of the moment, with some physical punishment. The volume of blood that was already pumping to a place in our child's brain where we don't want it gets a big boost, the amygdala. Our child's amygdala is now triggered with the emotion, fear, and connects that clear threat, you, to the fear, and the memory gets recorded. You are the threat, and the amygdala remembers. Trying to teach our child to rein in their emotional response of the amygdala, which requires their prefrontal cortex to be online and build that strong neural network to control their amygdala, our reactions have instead fired up their amygdala and taken their prefrontal cortex offline. As Dr. Medina states, only if the brain feels safe can it moonlight in algebra and French, or empathy. Now that we know the science and the life-changing consequences of getting it wrong or getting it right, what can we do? Just like the airlines tell you when you're responsible for someone else. We named it, Put Your Mask On First. That's our next video.